Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my presentation. My name is Thomas Tinnefeld and I'm a professor of applied languages at Saarland University of Applied Sciences in Saarbrücken in southwest Germany. Before we start, I would like to thank the Slovene Association of LSP Teachers for your invitation. I'm very happy to give this talk to you today. The topic will be the role of the teacher in the foreign language classroom, past, recent and future developments. Let's have a quick look at the outline of the talk. So of course we'll start with an introduction, then it will be about the teacher's role in the past. We go on talking about the teacher's role in modern language teaching and then about the teacher's role in the future. The talk will be rounded off by concluding remarks. That's the ladies and gentlemen who are the kind of representatives and who symbolize the different methods and approaches we are going to talk about. So this is Confucius, who says that if you think in terms of a year, plant a seed. If in terms of 10 years, plant trees. If in terms of 100 years, teach the people. And that's actually what our range should be, which should think in decades rather than years. The role of the teacher has changed drastically in the past 70 years. A snapshot of things just for your reference, and also to have most of the language things I'm going to say. That would be the macro structural perspective of teachers' functions and roles. We can just have a quick look at that and then go on. Our level will be the microstructural perspective. And on this level, there's been a constant redefinition of the teacher's role if we think and look at things closely. So we are not going to rewrite the history of language methodology. That's impossible anyway. And most of you will know what I'm talking about because many of us have experienced either the whole range of what we are talking about, so several decades, or at least some of that. So we're going to look back so as to look forward. What I would like to show you and also do some awareness raising of things we know anyway, in large parts at least, is to show the drastic change of the teacher's role in the foreign language classroom over time. First, there was, of course, the teacher as the only source of knowledge in the classroom. There are some things that are coming up again and again for learning purposes. And later on, the language advisor and learning facilitator, that's a new role. That's not the latest role, as for my understanding, but the question is now, has there really been such a reduction of the teacher's role? So from the only source of knowledge in the classroom to just an advisor, learning advisor, and that's what we're going to analyze, inclusive of virtual teaching. We are focusing, of course, on teaching general language and also on teaching languages for specific purposes. Most of the time, the LSP teacher comes extra because most of the things that are valid for general language teachers are also valid for LSP teachers. So we are departing from the situation in Germany. And because I am German, so that's one of the reasons, if I may add this a little bit funnily. And many of these aspects and developments can be generalized to other countries. So now we go on to the second chapter. We're talking about two central approaches. These, of course, both methods are still being used. The teacher's role in the grammar translation method departed from Latin and Greek. Actually, living languages were taught the same way as Latin and Greek were taught. It was about learning grammatical rules and applying them by way of translation. So this is Rachel, who symbolizes this approach for us. And Rachel, in this case, was the only expert in class as the teacher. The behavior was to incite learners to speak by giving them clear guidelines of what they had to say. So it was translation, it was grammar focused, it was about introducing, training and practicing grammar. And naturally, the teacher was in the limelight. The teacher was the only expert in class. The teacher was the very center of what was going on. this is one of the more communicative, although I'm hesitant using this word communicative, instructions you might think of. Imagine you're at a German train station, you would like to buy a ticket to Frankfurt. What would you say in German? So if we take German as an example. Learners were expected to produce the German sentence, and then of course they got either praise or correction, both from the teacher. Sometimes the teacher had other students correct what was wrong first, but rarely. So most of the time the teacher was still in the limelight, and the importance was the sentence, not the situation. The students had a passive role. The teacher was not the only expert in class only, but also the only authority in class. And that's why interaction was merely authority oriented. We're a good team now. Thank you very much for changing the slides. So Rachel's role was the boss in the classroom. She had kind of absolute power. She decided what was being done and what was being said even. And she was uncontested in her role as a teacher. She also decided what was right or wrong, depending on her performance and on her expertise, on her language skills and knowledge. The only person to give input and the only active part, because the learners, as I said, remained passive. So this was actually the strongest role, from my understanding, from my perspective, the strongest role the teacher had in the classroom ever, in the language classroom. So for the audiolingual method, it's Randy who is our representative. The audiolingual method was developed, as you all know, after World War II by Charles Fries. The basis was behavioristic, so stimulus, response, reinforcement, so that be learned what was reinforced. The focus was imitation and repetition. And very often, of course, we had, if they were present in schools, language labs, and the teacher was the only expert in class then. Pattern drill was actually one of the most prevalent types of exercises to be done in this audiolingual method. And this was a kind of mechanical training of a given linguistic structure. The structure remained the same within one and the same exercise. And as we can see with Randy holding the board, is that repetition was intended. Repetition was to lead to learning, but the learning type was not really intellectual learning, but rather rote learning. And students had a feeling of producing correct sentences. So they could say sentences by imitating a certain pattern, but they had this impression of doing something, of learning something. So this method, or this drill particularly, enabled students to acquire grammar without learning any explicit rules. They could learn rules, but they didn't have to. Sometimes there was some kind of rule outline, some example sentences, and then they could deduce the rules from that. And one example is this one. So Peter will go to London in June, then something had to be done using the verb be. And then the students had to produce a sentence like, he had never been to London, or Jane will buy a car soon, she has never bought a car. Mary is looking forward to wearing her own mini dress, she has never worn a mini dress, things like that. That was the type of instruction which was on there. So Randy's role as the teacher in the audiolingual classroom was to supervise learners' sentence or sentences, to provide correction feedback to learners, so just what Rachel had done, and to give students information about grammar when it was about written, or pronunciation when it was about oral language. Randy and his colleagues represented a kind of learning guide as well, but still a kind of expert learning guide, but not the same, with the same absolute role of power as Rachel had, and they were not really omniscient experts. So the content was often taught by defining technical terms. So the starting point clearly was grammar, was language, sorry, the lexicon, and a sound background knowledge for a teacher was quite nice, but not really necessary. One could teach commercial correspondence or business English without really having a very deep insight into all this. So Randy's role in LSP was more or less the same as in the general foreign language classroom, but he was not an expert in the field. He was a language expert. The teacher's expertise was predominantly on general language, but in LSP, background was taught, the language was taught against the background of the target language. So as I said, we started from language. That's where we departed from. And the role of the teacher was more limited than in the grammar translation method. So in those stages of language teaching, the role of the teacher was simple and easy to perform, and perhaps that's why many people became language teachers. I have this impression. So then we can go on, please. We go on to the next chapter. So in this modern approach, we talk about communicative and the constructivist approach. The teacher's role here has become more complex. And there I actually would like to use the present tense because that's still the way we teach today. That's why we are talking about the present, but also with a past perspective. We'll talk about the present with a future perspective a little bit later on. So now it's Chantal, the communicative approach. That's our representative for this one. And in the communicative approach, of course, communication and interaction were the most prevalent aspects. So it was no longer language correctness, which counted, which was important, but language fluency. And that was the phenomenon which had priority over accuracy. So that was a totally new paradigm, a whole paradigm change of methodology and language teaching. The consequence was an increased communicative competence of learners. So learners were and have been speaking foreign languages rather fluently, very spontaneously, but many of them made a lot of, and have made and are still making, a lot of mistakes in their utterances. Chantal's role is to elicit learners' utterances and discussions. Her linguistic expertise is no longer so much in the foreground. Of course, she has to master the language very nicely, to lead students, to guide them, to discuss with them. But this kind of grammatical expertise, which was prevalent beforehand, is in the background now. What is in the foreground, apart from communicative skills of the teacher, is the concrete idea of the content to be taught. Classroom discussions had to be maintained. Students had and have to be motivated to be active in class. They are still praised for their contributions, as has always been the case, and mistakes are corrected, but only the worst ones. So this Chantal is actually disguising her own language expertise and reducing that to the minimum. She's a kind of show host, playing an interactive role, and we have to recognize that, which I already mentioned, that non-linguistic factors have become more important than linguistic factors, like discussions are more important than, for example, language correctness. So what about the LSP classroom? So the teacher's role is exactly the same, and there's some more thing to be added to that. There's the necessity of getting much better informed about other fields, like business, law, engineering. Beforehand, this had not been necessary. It was always nice and a kind of luxury formerly. Now it has become a necessity. And still, as a pure language teacher, the LSP teacher's expertise in terms of content is not comparable to that of a non-content teacher. But there is, and sometimes there was, the option which people made use of to do team teaching once finances were very luxury and whatever. Team teaching to put language and content on the same level. So one language expert, one content expert, but actually that was and has been luxury. The question back then was, that's a question raised in LSP methodology, should you be the language teacher or the content course teacher to be the instructor in LSP classes? And back then, the answer was the language teacher. So the language teacher was given priority in that field, in this area. And the teacher's language and linguistic expertise was valued more highly than his or her content-based expertise. overall, we can say that there has been a drastic change of the teacher's role. He is no longer the expert or in class or the administrator of knowledge, but rather the primus inter pares. That means the first among his peers, which means the first among his or her students. So the teacher's role in the constructivist approach is again a little bit different. One can say that constructivism represents the shift from education based on behaviorism to education based on cognitive theory. Here we have BAPS as the representative. BAPS classroom activities are active, action-oriented learning, and learning procedures, projects, tasks, group work, for example. And that's why we call this task-based learning, which is in the focus here. The language is rather important, but again, only at the surface level. Mistakes and errors made by students are not in the foreground. What is in the foreground is the task or project to be realized. As I said, language correction is of minor importance only when communication is at stake. And again, there's a modification of the teacher's role, not a drastic one, but a slight one. As Judith Lanier formulated back then in 1990, she was back then professor of education at Michigan State University. It was about designing and guiding students through engaging learning opportunities. It was about searching out and constructing meaningful educational experiences and solving real-world problems. So actually this was quite and has been quite attractive up to the present day, hasn't it? So BAP's role in this case is finding and defining tasks or projects, setting the rules of these projects, supervising students' interaction, very often done in group work, and judging learners' project or task-based performances. She will comment on students' presentations, and she would have a precise idea about the extra-linguistic content to be taught. One can say that this is rather close to expert knowledge now. She will possibly correct highly relevant language errors, that's what we said, and work in a content rather than language-based context. So the teacher then is no longer the authority or the expert in the classroom, but clearly a learning partner who suggests guidelines. He's hierarchically, he or she, slightly above students. But there's a kind of narrowing the gap between teachers and students. So what about the LSP teacher in this case? The LSP teacher, there we can find a tendency of the constructivist approach towards CLEAR. I would like to see CLEAR very, very generously here and very generally here, rather, sorry. You can see that under CLEAR here, we don't have to talk about this. So that's the most general approach to CLEAR one can think of. Because the main feature of content and language integrated learning, CLEAR, is that language for specific purposes is only a side product of teaching. It's no longer the very center of interest, but taught in passing. I mean, that's the idea of a professor of economics teaching basic economic skills in a lecture, but doing that in English. Skills and knowledge, of course. The main focus then is content. LSP teaching is taken over by the content instructor. And of course, this comes with a loss of importance for the LSP teacher, which again is an unprecedented paradigm change for LSP teachers, not for general teachers, but for LSP teachers. All in all, we can say that it's a kind of reorientation away from linguistic competence towards factual competence, like following the logics of the constructivist approach, just as people did group work content-based in the language, general language classroom. They did the same in the LSP classroom, and this was clear or very close to clear. The linguistically competent LSP teacher has been replaced by the content-oriented experts, often with only limited foreign language competence. So there's a shift. If we ask the question again, should it be the language teacher or the content expert to teach such courses? Many people would say, it's the content expert. Okay, thank you. So from my perspective, this is a counterproductive development. This can be seen as the end of fruitful LSP teaching. If this development is not corrected at a short up to medium term level, there's definitely the danger of this loss in LSP teaching being perpetuated. So we should define clear guidelines between the expert and administrative competence of the language teacher and that of the content course teacher. That's important. There'll be another delimitation coming up later. And teacher's importance is that of the general language teacher in those courses in which the language teacher is still the LSP teacher. Then the importance of both general language and LSP teacher can be seen as roughly the same. So the general content text up to here is that there's been a continuous reduction of the teacher's authoritative importance in class, yet the complexity of his work has increased drastically, and it will even go on. This reduced importance and the increased complexity of his work are inversely proportional to each other. Now we get to the teacher's role in the future. In the future, it's the virtual classroom, and then there'll be future developments we're going to talk about. And the teacher's role in the virtual classroom is symbolized by Noah. And we can say that actually the future started last year. The future started with the pandemic in February, March, perhaps April, depending on when we started teaching online last year. And this again has been a dramatic change in our daily teaching practices from traditional on-site teaching to online instruction. This has caused and will still cause considerable challenges at times. So that's again, as I said, a drastic change in the teacher's role and also a different status quo, which is highly interesting from what I think, I must say. And this new step is actually a boost to the importance of the teacher's role. Actually, from what I see things, like you might see things differently, we benefit from this to a certain extent. So the virtual teacher possibly acts within all the four methods or approaches. So everything which I have just been talked about might be in the range of the virtual teacher's classes. But of course, there's a clear affinity to the communicative and the constructivist, and here it should say approach. Okay, so anything said before is actually transferable to the virtual teacher, but a lot comes extra. One of the problems we have, and which we might all have felt, is a lack of the feeling of togetherness. So being in different real and virtual classrooms. In the real classroom, there's a multisensorial feeling. That means we are in the same place and we feel that. We can see, hear, touch, whatever. In the virtual classroom, there's only visual and acoustic feeling. So we can't really touch things or whatever, the chairs we see in the togetherness mode in Teams, for example. So then there's undeniable group identity in the real classroom. We are a classroom, we are a group of people, and we feel like a group with our students and our students on their own as well. In the virtual classroom, there are loose groups of clearly separated individuals. So actually everyone is a group and every individual is on his or her own. In the real classroom, we are geographically confined. Nobody can really get out without anyone noticing that. Evasions are possible in the virtual classroom anytime, however. In the real classroom, the student situation is that of potential pressure. So the teacher might always call on the student. The student might lower his head when not knowing anything. I try to play this now. That all does not apply to the virtual classroom, because for students, that's a comfortable situation. They can always say, oh, my camera didn't work, my microphone didn't work, I couldn't hear you, whatever. What a teacher might have found comfortable in this classroom, calling on students rather easily, expecting answers and mostly getting answers, has changed in the virtual classroom because the situation often is unexpected and sometimes perhaps even unpleasant for teachers when they ask questions and there's no one answering and there's long and unendurable silence. So the feeling of togetherness is actually lost. A possible way out of this situation is to make teaching as interactive and interesting as possible, but the question is how? And one of the ways is to build rapport with students in order to bridge the geographical gap. But again, how can we build rapport? So in order to build rapport, we must first be rapport builders, and that's one of the functions of and roles of virtual teachers we now have. And By starting our classes informally, for example, the teacher can build such rapport as the integrative person in the room, which means that we might ask students to talk about their week once we see them once a week, or we might, if we are good at that, crack a joke or tell a joke, or ask students to talk about something else, and only after 5 minutes will we start our class, for example. We might show, and we have to show presence through visibility. This symbolizes the together mode in Microsoft Teams. What we can also do is calling on students frequently. We have to. In this case, we are more authoritative, but in this case, not to exert power, but to establish an individual bond and to establish contact with students. The clapping hands there symbolize applause. Applause and praise are very important. Sometimes I must say I have a relieving feeling when I say, okay, there's been group work, let's applaud for the group that has just presented their findings. And then everyone applauds, and you can see the joy in the people's faces and students' faces who get this applause. And this is really a relieving feeling for all the atmosphere in class. That means that the virtual teacher is an informed, flexible, and versatile practitioner. At least he or she has to. So he has to be flexible and versatile in terms of his methodology. There's less tolerance for boredom than in on-site classes. So I think boredom tolerance has gone down as we expect phases of the same activity being longer than is the case. A quick change of methods is a necessity in the online classroom, so even quicker change than in the on-site classroom. We need different tools and approaches to work on the 4 basic language skills, for example, Google Docs, YouTube for listening, Flipgrid for speaking, for example, Insert Learning for reading, all these tools which are legion and which will become more and more numerous, and we have to keep ourselves updated in terms of all of them, or at least some of them, which are workable. So that means the virtual teacher creates his own learning environment. We create our own environment just as we conduct our own orchestra, just as we act as magicians or as actors. And we have to try our best to master these technical gadgets and the potential of conferencing platforms, for example, like Zoom, Teams, or WebEx. The virtual teacher is an ambitious teacher, has to be, but as for me, he or she should be a realistically ambitious instructor, because we need to be selective. So I'm coming up with a very bad, and because it's a doubtful example, but for example, if somebody never does group work in class, I hope this is not the case, but there might still be colleagues who don't do that, he or she doesn't need any knowledge about channels or breakout rooms. So in this case, if this teacher doesn't change his methodology, he doesn't need that. But what we need is the settings that we can master for what we want to do. And then a methodologically ambitious teacher may also be, and will certainly be, a more ambitious teacher, technically speaking. So what we always have to do more than ever before is regular introspection sections. So we have to wonder about what worked well and what did not. Then we should also aim high but shoot low, if I may say so. Down-to-earth ways, as long as they work, are as good as highbrow ones. So we should vary technology-based methods as a fruitful change for students, different methods, different tools. And that's about presentations, for example. If it's about presentations in class, they can be live or they can be pre-recorded. Once we know students or ourselves have bandwidth problems, why can't these presentations be pre-recorded? No problem at all. If we think our class time is precious and students should watch each other's presentations, each other's videos, so that we can save time in class, they should be pre-recorded. If we have Q&A sessions, they should be live. If we want technologically top-notch presentations, then they should be pre-recorded, because they will never be totally perfect once they are live. The most important factor then is functionality. And this is a very vivid example because that's what we've just been doing today. So if you want to present a YouTube video in class, it's about screen sharing. So you play the video on your computer, share your screen, or you do link-based watching. So what about the LSP teacher then? And there's also a huge chance in that. The virtual LSP teacher, of course, has undergone and will undergo the same developments, but there's one more point, because once we use technology anyway, so we are online anyway, our students are, we can easily visualize complex concepts which are relevant to the respective language of specific purposes being taught. For example, by presenting students with pictures, graphs, by even having them do research work online, that means we can really bridge the content gap which we might have, which we might feel in our classes. And that's the highest possible relevance in the virtual LSP classroom. That means what could not be done in an offline classroom where you didn't have, perhaps you didn't even have internet access, just a blackboard and very toned down equipment. That's what you can easily do now. So the virtual LSP teacher is also a gap bridger in this respect between LSP content and the students' prior or LSP knowledge in general. So that means that the LSP teacher is now gaining ground compared to the content course instructor by being able to make the best use of the new media and their nearly unlimited combination of resources. So what about future developments? Predictions, of course, are difficult, but the basis has already been laid. So what is most important for teachers now is being updated and keeping themselves updated methodologically and technically. As a future teacher, we all have to be not experts, but expert users of one of the or several of the most important conferencing platforms. We have to be aware of and able to functionally use their most important features. Again, the features we need. For example, in MS Teams, when we started in April, there was no such thing as a large gallery mode, not to mention a together mode. That's actually the together mode, which we see here. There are different settings even now. You can be in the woods or you can be in a lecture hall. That's all new developments which we have to cope with and catch up with. So the future teacher ideally makes the best possible use of social media to keep him or herself updated on the latest methodological findings and best practices of experienced teachers. So if you have a Facebook group or you're a member of that, you can use this to keep yourselves updated, which many of you will definitely do. Once we formally had the textbook, and one textbook per year, actually, per academic year, we have different platforms now and a constant development that shows how dynamic the teaching profession has become. Only as far as that aspect is concerned. What we need is a high information standard, for example, and not in the least, or last but not least, so to speak, via social media. So there's a spread of individual knowledge in social media through apps, through people discussing online and whatever, which can lead us to imitate and also to adapt what they do, to our purposes. Please allow me to call this a Wikipediaization of methodological knowledge. That's an unprecedented grassroots movement, an unprecedented bottom-up movement, and also a democratization of foreign language methodology, which creates more opportunities for finding information, but also more obligation, because when there's a chance, there might be a necessity to follow, to learn this information, and thus more pressure. The future teacher will be a highly flexible and internationally oriented instructor. That's actually hidden in all this, which I have been saying. We can go on, please. So there's the constant need of self-re-education. There's a change also from hierarchical information to peer-to-peer training, because if we have a look at the internet, we browse the internet and find what other teachers do, that's from peers to peers. So more internationalization, of teacher education. So we might have a look at what teachers do in America, in Australia, in France, in Sweden, for example. So we might follow international rather than purely national approaches. The teacher of future times, of upcoming decades, might also teach not only in his or her country, but in other countries. And this trend of internationalization and globalization might revolutionize the job market. That means one day, and perhaps in the not too distant future, who knows, we might apply to a university which is not placed in Slovenia, Germany, Greece, Sweden, whatever, but in the United States or in Great Britain or in Russia or whatever. So this may also be a trend in this respect, and we might even stay at home working for this institution, but not even leaving our places. That's also true the other way around. We might find or even face perhaps a worldwide recruitment of students, university students, and virtual courses, students residing in their countries, but being enrolled at my university. That would be a new type of, a most modern type of a multilingual classroom. We will all have to be active and competent agents in the then educational village, which is the world. So the world will be, has already been, but will even be more than now, an educational village. We will have to keep ourselves updated. That's what I said. So that's just a recapitulation of this. In terms of our teaching, our own purposes, just some examples of apps like Kahoot, EduPuzzle, Quizlet, for example, for class activities, so that we will see constant teacher adaptation, which is very, very dynamic. We will also have to be hybrid instructors. That's actually a tendency which we can still see, which means we will have to do on-site and online classes at the same time, blended teaching. We should know about the advantages and inconveniences of all that. We have to be informed and constantly informed and selective about different learning management systems. That's all you know. Google Classroom, Moodle, Canvas. And we will also have to think in terms of virtual reality. That means virtual reality university, perhaps rather university, but school teachers, but one never knows, might create or might act in homogeneously generated international classrooms. That would be much more than just something like the Teams together mode or something, which still is much better than nothing, but not as perfect as one could imagine things to be. Then there'll be realistic impressions of online classrooms via VR glasses, and virtual reality might even either replace or complement language immersion. We already have something like virtual tour creators, virtual tour creator by Google. We will have to constantly and totally redefine our role in the second half of this decade, also in competition with machine translation, but this is a new topic. That's what we will talk about today. Like Google Translate and DeepL, that's what we will not do here and now. What about the LSP teacher? And again, there's a huge chance from my perspective, because there'll be a combination of LSP content background and language-oriented approach, and the conflict between, or the competition, whatever you name it, between either clear teaching and traditional LSP teaching will be lifted. We can have clear done by YouTube and TED Talks, for example. Then we would get the highest ranking and most highly reputed content teachers. In their lectures, they could be native speakers, for example. So we would not have to do the content part so much, but we would do the language part. That means this could be one of these clear delimitations, which I talked about earlier, of LSP teachers and content course teachers. Of course, on top, and this is an eternal topic, we will continue preparing students for soft skills in the future, like creativity, communication, collaboration, critical thinking. That's a must, and it will always be. All in all, we can say that education is just some clicks away with all its advantages and also all its pressure. There will be even more, that's what I said before, online e-learning, self-paced platforms like we have Coursera, Khan Academy, for example. And then we can say that the future teacher will then be a technical expert user, a methodologically oriented social media user, a flexible instructor, an active and competent agent in the educational village, which is the world, a modernist open to the latest methodological developments of his or her time, a hybrid on-site and online teacher, virtual realist, so not being overwhelmed by what he's doing, but making things work in class, a constant redefiner of the role model of a teacher, also with regards to machine translation, but that's what we won't do today, as I said. And the role of the future teacher will be defined by much more complexity than ever before, and by a totally different set of challenges. Now we're getting to the concluding remarks. So the teacher is presently becoming more and more important and also dominant again. So he or she is much more now than just a student's learning partner as well, but much more than that. He organizes, he or she, in a stringent and consistent manner, must also be a highly efficient time manager. It needs a lot of mastery of technical gadgets, apps, and skills. After all, it's again the central eminence in the classroom, but facing new major challenges and changes as well as virtual teaching. So as an LSP teacher, he is widely comparable to the role of a general teacher, but facing numerous hugely different challenges, as I pointed out beforehand. And of course, what we always need and will always need and have always needed is motivation, enthusiasm, and responsibility. So this hasn't changed, and I hope this will never change. And excellence is never an accident. It is always the result of high intention, sincere effort, and intelligent execution. It represents the wide choice of many alternatives. Choice, not chance, determines your destiny. Educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all, and that's what we should not forget at all with all that we've been talking about so far. I do thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much. Thank you for your patience.